Good morning, dear colleagues. My name is Nuno Aguirre de Cárcer. I'm with the Spanish and Latin American Studies Department here at the School of Languages, Literature and Media, Wits University. I'm happy to contribute to the blended Symposium on blended online learning for teaching of literature, languages, and media studies. The topic that I would want to introduce is e-portfolios as means of assessing formative and summative assessment in the literature classroom. And the reason I want to do this is because I find that there's usually a gap between the experience of the classroom and the assessment process of literature through summative assessments such as essays and final dissertations. And my intuition and my hypothesis is that blended learning can be a great means to connect these two experiences, which tend to be quite different. What happens in the classroom, which is mostly based on commentary, on analysis, on criticism, and work in progress, and having open discussion. And then what happens in the assessment process, which tends to be much more rigid and fixed. So my idea would be that portfolios, and specifically e-portfolios, would be a great tool to help us enhance the experience of students and learners in the literature classroom. So first, I would like to introduce the rationale of a portfolio in the literature classroom, and then later we can analyze whether the option for blended learning and e-portfolios in this particular context is more or less effective for our purposes. So what then is a portfolio and why is it effective for our purposes of literature assessment? When the first thing is that a portfolio is very useful in terms of formative assessment. It consolidates work to date and it allows for the students to see the work in progress. Secondly, it provides a very structured feedback loophole. It shows what the student has learned, and it allows for the students to see where does he need to improve, and creates what is usually referred to as an entrapment, which may be the term and might not be. I particularly don't like it, but it kind of forces the student into deep processes of learning and a deep approach to learning, which is not unlike what happens in a peer review process, where work is consolidated and further refined. So I think in this sense, portfolios are a very good preparation for what happens in a postgrad level and of course in the academic environment. And it allows for our postgrad students and PhD students to be much more familiar with the environment that we'll be facing in the professional academic world. And the third reason is that an e-portfolio is a student-led assessment in the sense that the student can choose if the portfolio is designed properly from a variety of materials that are taught in the classroom based on his or her own preferences, the aspects that the individual finds more challenging or appealing or relevant to his or her own experience. So in that sense, it's student-led, and it also allows for creativity, for open thought, and for developing the thought process, mostly through writing, but portfolios, and specifically e-portfolios, allow for a wider range of options, such as creating a podcast, conceptual maps, and really there's no limit to what can be included in an e-portfolio in terms of the use of technology, which I think it's a clear advantage of e-portfolios over more traditional portfolios of reading portfolios, for instance. So let us discuss now briefly what advantages an e-portfolio offers us as opposed to more traditional portfolios. From the perspective of the academic, the teacher or facilitator of the course, then if structured properly, it can definitely reduce the workload of the teacher, so it can allow us for a much more effective feedback loophole in undergraduate courses where we have many students and it might not be that easy to access the working process, the thoughting process. So I think an e-portfolio, if designed properly, can really enhance that without adding a huge workload on the side of the teacher. And it also allows for a much more effective way of communicating. It's much more structured than the more traditional e-portfolio where there's commentaries and notes and it's coming back and forth without a real sense of structure. The other aspect that is interesting about e-portfolios is that it's not limited to individual work. As we'll see a bit later on, the increasingly growing number of tools and software techniques for e-learning that allow for collaborative projects in terms of e-portfolios in the literature classroom, and of course can be applied to media studies as well, to studies of languages and other disciplines in the humanities. This idea of the netfolio as a collaborative project, it's something that I particularly find very useful and that can allow for peer interaction, peer learning, open discussion, and other forms of learning that are important in the contemporary world and that are important to be introduced through the blended learning as well. It is important also to highlight a difficulty around e-portfolios. One that I have experienced in my own teaching and learning here at Wits is that students may not be that tech savvy and they might find the use of technology or the systematic use of technology as forms of assessment challenging, and instead of going towards a deep approach to learning, actually they can choose a surface approach to learning using the most obvious technology. So just to give you an example, in last year's third-year course of Spanish and Latin American literature, one of the options I provided to the students was to create a conceptual map or a structure system of thought that would summarize the two lessons that we had viewed in weeks 3 and 4. And then one of the students chose to actually do a conceptual map using CMAP, but the other two went for a plain PowerPoint slide bullet point list. So what I'm trying to say here is that the use of technology may not be that obvious for all learners, and that when we use e-portfolios, we have to make it in such a way that it allows for creativity without overwhelming the students, allowing epistemic access to each and every one of them, and of course, making sure that we are encouraging the deep approach to learning instead of throwing our students towards a much more surface approach, where it's just ticking boxes and just getting something out of our way. So that's a challenge that I particularly have found in the use of e-portfolios, and that I'll be happy to discuss with colleagues attending the symposium and see what solutions and options we have found. So later in this short presentation, I'll be discussing some aspects around the more innovative views around e-portfolios, as well as some of the tools and software that I found particularly useful around this idea of formative assessment through e-portfolios.
Now, moving into the issue of e-portfolios and netfolios. According to Barbera, there are 4 key characteristics that a good e-portfolio should have. Namely, their metacognition, authentic task, contextual feedback, and student responsibility. That means that the student is able to self-regulate. The problem is that sometimes the individual e-portfolios don't really achieve all of these aspects together, in the sense that students are working individually and pieces of work are kind of put together, and there might not be a complete work or a coherent work which is submitted at the end. So that's one of the shortcomings, and there's been criticisms of e-portfolios in this regard as just disparate pieces of work that do not equate. They're not as deep learning as you can have in a dissertation or a final summative essay. So can this be addressed with a collective work Well, according to Barbera, yes, this can happen because a collaborative project, a collaborative e-portfolio, a netfolio, includes peer assessment and includes self-assessment. Therefore, the self-regulative aspect, the student responsibility aspect, and the contextual feedback is much stronger. Or, yeah, perhaps not stronger, but it's much more present in the structure of the portfolio. And secondly, um, one has to really bear in mind that in the context of blended learning, be it e-portfolios or netfolios, the quality and the structure of the feedback needs to be much more explicit than in one-to-one interaction. But there might be a much more informal discussion. Now, in the online and the blended learning, we have to be extremely explicit and careful in the design of our portfolio, and also if we're going for a collective netfolio, as to how exactly the structure, the feedback loop is going to be constructed in terms of the software that we can use. I will have a little commentary on that right after this section. And also, what is it that us as lecturers, as well as peers, and what is the self-assessing processes, what are the procedures that we're going to be including in our e-portfolios and netfolios in order to assure the four characteristics mentioned by Barbera are truly met. I would like to conclude by commenting a little bit around the issue of selecting the software for the e-portfolios and the netfolios. Because, of course, selecting the tool might be very relevant to the way we design the portfolios and whether it becomes effective or not. And, of course, it's hard to keep updated with all the different options that have been developing. So I'm using an article by Klimt and Baumgartner, which it's actually evaluation of e-portfolio software. Highly recommendable because it classifies a number of features around e-portfolios and gives actually a scale of what are the advantages and what are the shortcomings of different options, and then depending on exactly what kind of e-portfolio and what kind of feedback and task are we going to be designing, then one can opt for one option or the other. And the one I'll be commenting upon, it's recently developed specifically e-portfolio software, which is called Mahara, developed in New Zealand. It's not entirely different to what we have here at Wits University, where we're using Sakai, but Sakai is not exactly an e-portfolio software. It has features that can be implemented as e-portfolio. So in that sense, if one is not developing a full system of e-portfolio, Sakai, which is open source as well, might be a very useful tool. So it can be integrated in what we are already doing here at Wits University for those of you who might be listening and are from the institution. But when we look at Mahara, it's a specifically designed software for e-portfolio. So I would like just to highlight a couple of aspects and then leave you for you to explore these open source e-portfolios. Here we are at the website of Mahara. As you can see, I've downloaded the demo version, and I've already created my profile there in the section. That part is classic. And then quickly going over the key features of this software, of this platform for electronic portfolios. As you can see, it has a number of options that one can create. So there's these three key elements that I want to comment upon. First, it's the option of creating the e-portfolio. As it says here, it's quite flexible. And I'll go over some of the details a bit later on. The second key aspect is the sharing. So the content can be made available to TUTs, to supervisors, to key lecturers, so whether it's undergrad, postgrad, that part of sharing the work in progress, having comments on it, and a good feedback loop, it's quite ensured with this tool. And it does not stop there because it also allows for engaging further in the sense of that it doesn't need to be contained or limited to the experience of the classrooms, but it can be expanded into other beyond the limits of the university. And I think this is quite important and quite an interesting feature of this software, which is of course not unique. Other softwares also have it, but it's quite important that it's there. So in terms of what can be created, if one goes here into the creation section, then there's, as you can see, quite a number of different options. Of course, pages and collections would be the most useful one, the most obvious one, more connected to the traditional portfolio, like the written portfolio. So I've created here one sample that could be used in my Latin American literature course in third year. So then, as you can see, well, I've created the document, and then you could add a comment, and then you can add documents and different things, and can be edited, etc., etc. So this is a more obvious or traditional aspect of this, which is of course needed. But then there are files that can be uploaded, and then there's this aspect which I find very useful to implement the self-regulating aspect, the student's responsibility aspect that was mentioned before, by terms of journaling, by means of a journal. So here I've created a sample for my course. The first reading in the course, it takes weeks 1 and 2, José Martín's Nuestra América. So here the students, after the lectures, could write a reflective piece, summarizing the key points perhaps, or explaining their understanding of the text, etc., etc. That can be made available to the tutorials, or to myself in this case, because I'm the one lecturer for this course. And then there's the opportunity to engage with that content, to refine it, to add different readings, extra material, etc., etc. So I find this quite useful. As you can see, it can be published, and then you can unpublish where you're working on it. And it doesn't need to be something that gets graded. It could be just a reflective piece that it's there. Other options, plans, resumes, and skins. I won't go over all of this, but just dropping on the skin so you can see that this website, this software also has quite an attractive point. It's not just writing a material, but there's also options that make it more attractive for young learners. So, well, going back to the key, to the initial point, the dashboard, what could be what sounds to me is the big shortcoming of this software is that it does not quite allow for e-portfolios in the collective sense, the net folios that I've been talking about. So as you can see here, it's really individual work with very little room for peer evaluation, peer learning. Of course, it can be shared, and then there are options around it that can be explored. But it becomes quite concomitant with what we already have at the university in our Sakai system, where we have different options. As you can see, well, this is a sample course that I have here in first years. And then here, tests and quizzes, announcements, but one can add different options for wikis, as you can see here, and then polls, and then forums. There are many other options that are already built into our e-learning platform, and I'm pretty sure that in other institutions that might not be used in Sakai, this is also present. So as you can see, there are some shortcomings around this, but they can be combined with the more traditional systems of e-learning that are available at most universities. So I hope that was informative and that it allowed you to see a general overview of one of the sites that to me is the most specifically designed for e-portfolios. I do look forward to hearing all your comments and suggestions and criticisms and remarks. And yes, and I also hope to see you in person in the conference at Wits University in Johannesburg.
Thank you very much for listening.